Right, so for more on this, we're joined by Humphery-Jenner in Sydney. He's an associate professor of finance at the University of New South Wales Business School. Professor, good afternoon, I think it is to you, and thank you for your time. So many people will look at this report and ask, what's wrong with government supporting their own industries? Why are subsidies such a controversial issue in global trade?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. And the subsidies certainly have become more widespread over time. The OECD's report indicated that subsidies have increased across the board, although they have been relatively high in China. And part of the concern with this is from an international perspective, it doesn't create a level playing field, so to speak. But also part of the concern is domestic. With the government picking winners across sectors or across businesses, it means that other domestic entities can't compete quite as well because they might not have access to those subsidies for various reasons, many of which might be political in different countries. And that means you have an unlevel playing field both domestically and internationally. And part of the issue is that with increasing free trade, domestic entities, say in the United States, might argue that, well, they're competing against an entity overseas that has a lot of government support. So they aren't really able to compete because they're not in the same situation, which means that, say there's an entity in China that gets a lot of government support, is therefore able to sell things below market, and is therefore able to sell things under the price a US entity could sell it domestically. But this isn't because that Chinese entity is competing better, rather it's because the US entity simply doesn't have as much government support, or rather the government is enabling the entity, the exporter, to undercut that domestic entity, which is what's creating that controversy. And that's why there's a lot of blowback about it, and why there had been some pushes for tariff protection and the like.
But for consumers, Professor, subsidies can mean cheaper products. How much should regular people care about this? And should policymakers really focus on balancing the benefits of lower prices against concerns about unfair competition and overcapacity?
Absolutely. So in the short term, those subsidies can definitely create cheaper products, right? In that, say, for example, let's use a hypothetical. Say, for example, China is subsidizing car manufacturing. And this is just a hypothetical for the moment. Say they were subsidizing those. And then those cars are sent over to the United States. They will tautologically be cheaper than the US manufactured cars. And therefore, in the short term, it is good for consumers. They get cheaper goods. The problem is in the long term, and with the labor market, and also with domestic production. So let's unpackage that. So in terms of the long term, well, say, for example, China subsidizes cars to get a foothold into the United States, and then is able to send the US manufacturers to the wall because they are undercutting them. But those undercuts aren't going to live there forever. Rather, those Chinese goods will become more expensive when the US manufacturers start to go bankrupt, which means over the longer term, consumers are going to be worse off. The second aspect of this is the domestic capacity. So, for example, say GM or Ford or whatever the case might be were to cease operating, or then domestic jobs simply stop being there. So you get more unemployment. Now, in some ways, that can be a good thing from a country's perspective, in that it might shift to, say, higher impact labor or other sectors where they compete better. However, it's not here a matter of competition, rather it's a matter of who is getting the most government support, which is very different from being the most efficient enterprise. And then the next thing is from a US government perspective and a US tax perspective. Well, if these companies are sent to the wall simply because of foreign subsidies or foreign support, well, what that means is there's a reduction in tax base and a reduction in domestic growth. And that reduction isn't due to those companies being bad. The reduction is due to other support from governments overseas. So there's a lot of controversy over the medium to long term, even if goods are slightly cheaper in the short term.
I really appreciate you laying this all out and simplifying it, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
No, thanks so much for having me. Great being with you.